It's a journey to paradise and a journey to hell.
The atom bomb is here. It exists. We must look to the future.
The future. That was the Cold War and the arms race.
But they were fearing so powerful, yet they didn't really know what they were doing.
Something good for mankind.
For the supposed good of mankind, people were driven from their land, lost their huts, houses, and livelihoods.
We want to go back home. But at the moment, we cannot go back home. It's filled with radiation.
At the other end of the world, thousands of miles from all the major continents, lies the Bikini Atoll. White sand beaches, warm, crystal clear water, coconut palms. But what looks like a holiday paradise has been a radioactive hell for more than 70 years. Nuclear contamination has made this group of islands permanently uninhabitable. This remote yet so idyllic place was chosen by the USA to be their testing site for atomic weapons. To test the enormous explosive force of this new weapons technology, but also to demonstrate their power and superiority to the whole world, the U.S. military sank an entire armada of battleships. Today, they're a magnet for fearless divers. This is because these frigates, destroyers, and aircraft carriers are still packed with weapons and live ammunition. Lemoyo Abon was just 10 years old when on the island of Rongelap, some 200 kilometers from the center of the atomic explosion, the earth shuddered.
Yeah, because I was outside all the morning. Well, I don't know, but when it arrives, we thought it was, how come the sun is rising in the west? And all of a sudden, the sun just arrives. So we were kind of wondering. And some of the children, when they heard the very loud sound, they said, maybe American and Russian or maybe starting the war. Let's go at the ocean side and look for if there is ship.
Only a few years earlier, the war in the Pacific had raged in the region. In July 1945, the post-war world order had already been negotiated in Potsdam, though Japan still stubbornly resisted capitulation. But even in the final months of World War II, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the USA had already begun. That was also a factor when, despite territorial gains, American President Harry Truman gave the order to drop the atomic bomb. On August 6th, the long-range B-29 bomber Enola Gay took off with the bomb that had been named Little Boy on board. At 8:16 a.m., it detonated above Hiroshima. After the second bomb was dropped over Nagasaki 3 days later, Japan declared her capitulation.
7 p.m. Eastern Wartime, Bob Trout reporting. The Japanese have accepted our terms fully. That's the word we've just received from the White House in Washington. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of the Second World War.
The victorious Americans celebrated their bomb as if it were a gift from God.
Ladies and gentlemen, President of the United States.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. Having found the atomic bomb, we have used it. It is an awful responsibility which has come to us. We thank God that it has come to us instead of to our enemies, and we pray that He may guide us to use it in His ways and for His purposes.
Less than a year after the president's solemn words, there was to be another atomic explosion. But this time, not on enemy territory, but on the Marshall Islands. After being recaptured from the Japanese, this group of Pacific islands were a trust territory under American administration. For the next 12 years, they were to be an atomic weapons testing site. Today, they have still not recovered from the damage. Jack Niedenthal, himself an American, has been fighting for the rights of the Marshall Islanders for decades.
The U.S. was feeling so powerful at the time. And again, they were in that race with the Russians, but they were feeling so powerful, yet they didn't really know what they were doing. And it's evident everywhere. I mean, you just read through some of these documents that were released. And the idea that the U.S. came and took advantage of that. I mean, they spoke to the Bikinians on a Sunday after church. I mean, how insidious can you get? You talk to them on a Sunday after church, asking if they would be willing to go for the good of mankind and to end all world wars, and that they would be like America's children.
Scene 25, take 1. Well, now then, James, will you tell them that the United States government now wants to turn this great destructive force into something good for mankind? Something good for mankind.
All right, is that all?
Okay, got it.
They were in this arms race with the Russians. The Russians had already detonated a hydrogen bomb. The U.S. was like in a complete panic mode. They wanted to get things done. So they were rushing everything. And if you look at the old clips of some of the archival footage, they'll talk about the Bikinians as a nomadic people who moved around from place to place, even though they'd been in Bikini for centuries. They had purported all these myths about the Bikinians, so they were, I don't think they really cared about the Marshallese, is the easy way to put it.
We are all the children of God, King Judah, chief of the Bikinians, had said and agreed to the evacuation of his people for the good of mankind. 6 weeks before the first bomb tests, 167 inhabitants of the main island and 29 from the island of Enyu were transported to the smaller, infertile island of Rongerik. It was the beginning of an odyssey across numerous islands and atolls that went on for decades. Today, most Bikinians still live on Kili and Ijit. Kili is a tiny spot in the ocean hundreds of miles from Bikini. Majuro, the main island of the Marshalls, isn't much closer. The Japanese had used Kili as a prison island. Bikinians say it's still the same today. Officially, the population has meanwhile grown to over 5,000. The people here still call themselves Bikinians, though very few of them have actually ever seen Bikini itself. You can easily walk all around Kili on an afternoon stroll. The island has no harbor and no lagoon.
There's only one island, 3/4 of a mile long, 3/4 of a mile wide. So there's no lagoon. Like the other islands, they have all sort of fish. We want to go back home. But at the moment, we cannot go back home. It's filled with radiation.
A few months ago, 10 men from Kili set off to the land of their ancestors for the first time in 40 years. They documented their historical journey for posterity. Their mission? To bring back fish and seafood for the festival marking the anniversary of their deportation. They only knew the promised land from the stories told by their fathers. None of them had ever been there before. At first sight, the island appears intact. White sand beaches, turquoise blue water, and thriving coconut palms. Only their fruit is poisonous. Just being on Bikini, say the scientists, is not dangerous. Living on Bikini, however, is, because everything that grows and takes root here is still contaminated by radiation. The lagoon is teeming with life, as if nothing had ever happened. For the Bikinians from Kili, the island looks exactly as their forefathers described it, like paradise. So different from Kili, their new home. Fishing on the open sea is only possible when there's no wind. Very few coconuts ripen here.
I am lost in a place that is not mine, in a land that I do not own. I am drifting on the open sea. It is God's world, earth and water. That's what we sang when the Americans took us away.
The Americans, however, presented themselves as benefactors.
The atom bomb is here. It exists. We must look to the future. Up until now, only 3 have been exploded, and none over the water. It is the duty of the military services to explore the military might of this new weapon. We want to be prepared for any use of atomic energy that may become necessary, whether offensive or defensive.
So that the events could be witnessed by the rest of the world, over 20 tons of film equipment were brought along. Aboard the observation ships, sunglasses were provided and ice-cooled refreshments served, both of which became fashionable in the summer of that year, as did the creation of a French fashion designer, which was given the name Bikini.
The whole 1946 Operation Crossroads, where these were only nuclear weapons like they dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not very powerful, that was a show. They had 42,000 men and women up there, 5,000 radiation recording devices, rats, pigs, goats. This was this huge show, and it was just to show the Russians, hey, look what we have.
On the 1st of July, 1946, an armada of some 93 ships had gathered off the Bikini Atoll. Aircraft circled in the sky. The preparations for the first atomic test were already completed when Bernard Baruch, U.S. Representative to the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, advocated putting atomic energy worldwide under international control.
Behind the black portent of the new atomic age lies a hope which, seized upon with faith, can work our salvation. If we fail, then we have damned every man to be the slave of fear. Now, if ever, is the time to act for the common good.
It's Able Day, the 30th of June, 1946, the day of the first test.
At this time, NBC interrupts its regular program schedule to bring you a history-making broadcast, the actual dropping of the bomb at Bikini. In a matter of minutes now, an Army superfortress will drop that bomb on target ships in Bikini Lagoon. Aboard 22 target ships in the lagoon are the animals.
Put on goggles or turn away. Do not remove goggles or face burst until 10 seconds after the first light.
Crossroads, scene 1, take 1, A-day burst, USS Panamint.
Thousands of cameras and film cameras were at the ready. Half of all the world's film materials had been transported to the Bikini Atoll.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
The bomb attained an explosive yield equivalent to 23 kilotons of TNT, about the same strength as the one that had destroyed Nagasaki. Of the 93 target ships positioned around the atoll, including ships captured from the Japanese, the former German cruiser Prinz Eugen, but also numerous American cruisers, battleships, and aircraft carriers, 5 sank immediately, while the rest were seriously damaged. Directly after the detonation, U.S. Army units, accompanied by international observers, examined the damage and tried to assess the extent of the radioactive contamination. Most of the 5,400 test animals were killed instantly. Crossroads was only the beginning. Even today, the Bikini Atoll is still uninhabitable, and yet it's one of the world's most exclusive regions for diving. At a depth of around 160 meters lie the very ships that were exposed to the staged atomic attack all those years ago. Among them, the aircraft carrier USS Saratoga, measuring 250 meters. It's the longest wreck in the world that can be reached using breathing apparatus. Also on the seabed is the HIJMS Nagato, once the flagship of the Japanese Navy and involved in the attack on Pearl Harbor. The ships are now the property of the Bikinians. They are, as they say, our nuclear fleet. Underwater, but still dangerous for divers.
Short time later, 6 or 7 years later, the Russians detonate, it was confirmed, a hydrogen bomb. Well, the U.S. went into a panic, and they tried to they did detonate a hydrogen bomb on Eniwetok in 1952, which was called Mike. And that weapon was not usable in a war. In other words, it was the size of a 2-story house. It was nothing you could load on a plane and use. So it was still useless. The difference between that weapon and the weapon that was tested on Bikini is that was the first deliverable hydrogen bomb the U.S. had ever. In other words, it was small enough to put on a plane, and it turned out to be 15 megatons.
6 months after the Soviet Union had tested their first hydrogen bomb, preparations were underway for Operation Castle. The Bravo hydrogen bomb was to be the most powerful device the USA had ever detonated.
For this operation, a weapons assembly area was constructed at the southern tip of this valuable piece of real estate. This is the first time on any operation that weapons were assembled on parry and then moved out to the firing site.
The Bravo bomb was to be brought to the extreme northwest of the archipelago for detonation. 48 hours earlier, the Bikini Atoll had been evacuated completely. Only the firing team, responsible for detonating the bomb, remained in a specially constructed bunker on the south island of Enyu.
Recorders to read the yield of the primary bomb from its rate of neutron multiplication. Cloud sampling for radiochemical determination of fission yield and to assist in determination of total yield. High-speed cameras and photo towers for ball of fire photography to indicate total yield of the device. Scopes recording electromagnetic radiation, and cameras, both to obtain the time interval between primary and secondary bomb detonations.
On March 1st, 1954, the most powerful bomb of all time exploded. The scope of Operation Castle saw 6 further atomic tests carried out by mid-May. For the Romeo test, the first after Bravo, the bomb was detonated on a barge in the Pacific. This test method would later be used for all powerful weapons tests to prevent further contamination of the islands. For the operation's final test, Nectar, the technological advance was clear. With a weight of 2.6 tons, the bomb's explosive yield was 100 times greater than the Hiroshima bomb Little Boy that had weighed 4 tons. When the Marshall Islands gained independence, a body equivalent to a court, the Nuclear Claims Tribunal, was set up to rule on the compensation claims for damage incurred during the weapons testing program. To describe the enormous impact of the Bravo bomb, the authorities' head, Bill Graham, reads from the military's investigation report.
As the Bravo device detonated, a huge fireball formed. 10 million tons of pulverized coral debris were coated with radioactive fission products and sucked up into the rising fireball. Surrounded by moisture condensation rings caused by the passage of the shock wave, the huge bubble of superheated gas and debris rose 45,000 feet in the first minute, leaving behind a 4-mile-wide stem of radioactive debris. It continued to rocket upward, punching through the tropopause and into the stratosphere, and falling out over an area of hundreds and hundreds, thousands of square miles, including Rongelap, 110 miles from Bikini, Uterik, and others.
A film in keeping with the Hollywood style of the time describes the extent of the contamination.
Operation Castle, the fifth in a series of tests at the Pacific Proving Ground. The report which follows is a summation of what occurred at the Pacific Proving Grounds during that operation in 1954.
It is now known that fallout from the larger Castle shots blanketed areas of more than 5,000 square miles with radioactive material that would have been lethal to unprotected personnel.
In fact, after the Bravo test, both military and scientific personnel admitted their surprise at the violent intensity and power of the explosion. Newspapers reported 46 inhabitants of the nearby Rongelap Atoll who suffered radioactive contamination and were lucky to survive. The 23-man crew of a Japanese fishing vessel 140 kilometers away were heavily contaminated. One crew member died of radiation sickness. Fish, water, and land, everything was highly contaminated. The extremely toxic atomic fallout looked just like snow.
They went up and they fell on our foot, our body, our houses. Even the window were open. They just came in the window. We were itchy first, and after some days, something grew on our feet, like myself. And during the night, we were very itchy. But we didn't, because we only know this word, poison. We don't know about racism. Now I understand that it's colorless. We can see it, even smell it.
All of those exposed were taken to Kwajalein, where complete physical examinations were carried out. Every effort was made to assure their comfort and well-being.
Women usually got miscarriages, and they sometimes their babies, they do not look like real people.
The extent of the contamination only became clear later.
This is the graveyard of my mom. She was only 16 years old at the time of the Bravo shot. And the people of Rongelap was the closest to the explosion that happened on Bikini on March 1st. And she was one of the survivors at that time that were flown early on seaplane by the Navy because she was pregnant at the time. And, you know, my brother, Robert, this one was in her, stomach, when they transferred her from Rongelap to Kwajalein. And my brother died in 2008 of stomach cancer. And that particular cancer was related to nuclear radiation as part of the list that they have on their listings. This is one of my cousin, Harry. When the powder started pouring like snow, I mean, the environment was pretty dark because of the debris that were falling down. And as soon as it started hitting our people, their hair naturally keeps falling off. You can pull it, and they didn't know the cause of it, but somehow some of the elders felt that it could be from the snowflakes, they call it.
According to the military, there were two reasons why people had suffered. Firstly, the explosion was much more powerful than they had planned, and secondly, the wind had changed unexpectedly.
The tremendous yield resulted in a serious fallout situation at Bikini and certain other atolls downwind from ground zero. This was the forecast wind direction. The actual wind was in this direction, some 10 degrees less favorable than forecast. Even so, the winds were within the area of acceptable fallout. However, the unexpected high yield caused significant fallout to occur on Rongelap Atoll.
Both of those are absolute lies, and we learned about it later from their own documents. The first thing we learned was that myth that they weren't sure which way the wind was blowing was completely false. Once the Clinton administration released all those documents in the late 90s, it was clear they knew the wind was blowing in the wrong way, and those decisions were being made by the highest officials in the U.S. government. The President of the United States was the one giving the command to push the buttons. So that was completely false. They knew the wind was going in the wrong way. They knew it was blowing towards Rongelap and inhabited populations.
The island's 64 inhabitants had not been warned. They drank the contaminated water from the cisterns. Children rubbed radioactive dust into their hair, pretending it was soap. It wasn't until 48 hours later that the inhabitants were evacuated. But only 3 years after this, the islands were declared clean and safe.
From 1957 to 1985, we all have a thyroid cancer. They removed all of my thyroid.
The test program continued. Operation Castle alone involved 5 more bombs. 2 years later, Operation Red Wing was launched, with a further 17 thermonuclear tests. The devices were detonated on barges, on and below the water surface, dropped from planes, and ignited at varying heights. Tewa and Huron, on the 20th and 21st of July 1956, were the last in Operation Red Wing. 2 years later, Operation Hard Track followed, with another 10 bombs. In the 12 years since Operation Crossroads, the tiny group of islands had been devastated by a total of 23 bombs, transforming this mini paradise into a radioactive hell on Earth. Every substance that is radioactive can be found on the islands. This enemy is invisible. People and animals can't smell it or taste it. Only in high doses does it burn the skin like a hot light that no one can see. It creeps into the body, remaining undetected for years, unless it is permanently monitored, in which case human beings become no more than guinea pigs.
If this should happen, it would be a tragic thing for those injured, no matter how small the number. Whether these statistically very few casualties can be justified is a personal value judgment outside the scope of this report. Each citizen must make his or her own evaluation. There are those few who loudly maintain that there is no actual threat to the free world at all,
certainly none that can justify either nuclear testing or nuclear armament. The opposite viewpoint holds that the development of our nuclear power has been an absolutely necessary protection against communist hostility and nuclear threats. In this view, the fallout casualties, if any, will be seen as those of unidentified soldiers in the service of humanity, unknown soldiers in a war which has not struck, and which our nuclear power may indeed prevent from ever striking.
In 1985, almost 30 years after Rongelap had been declared radiation-free and its inhabitants allowed to return, they were evacuated once more. As the U.S. government didn't react to the islanders' repeated request, Greenpeace came to their aid. Also on board the Rainbow Warrior was activist Bunny McDiarmid. Today, she's executive director of Greenpeace International.
My first impression, it's beautiful. We sailed into this lagoon, which was very large and is completely surrounded by a string of small islands. And the largest island is named the same as the atoll itself. And the water is incredibly clear. You can see down meters to the bottom. And it's kind of like an idyllic, what you imagine in your head of a romantic little Pacific island, beautiful sandy islands with palm trees, with coconut trees everywhere. Into the water came a small boat, what the Marshallese call a boom boom, and it was full of women who were waving and welcoming us and holding up a sign that said, "We love the future of our kids." And on the shore was a archway that they had built welcoming us as well. And mostly it was the older women and older men that were in the front. And at the back were all the young men sitting on the ground. And even though their senator had been talking with them for many months about the fact that they would be moving and why they were moving, it wasn't until we actually showed up that it became something of a reality for people.
And reality had caught up with the islanders. 95% of the people who had been living on the island during the test years were suffering from thyroid cancer 30 years later. Children were being born with deformities.
We moved an amazing amount of equipment and possessions. We had our ship loaded to the absolute gunnels with equipment and people. And we made 4 trips backwards and forwards. It was an overnight trip, and then it was loading and unloading at both ends.
Henk Hazen was an engineer on Rainbow Warrior. His impressions of that day 30 years ago are still fresh.
One thing was loading the gear, but the people was the emotional side of it, because they were definitely affected by what was going on, by what happened to them, I mean, you can actually see it, there's children, and they're misformed, and it's all just right in front of you. And we're moving a people, we're moving a whole population of this island.
Operation Exodus took 4 days and 4 nights. 3 times Rainbow Warrior had to make the 100-kilometer journey between Rongelap and the island of Mejato. But finally, they had successfully managed to transport 300 inhabitants and around 100 tons of materials. And yet the tragedy remained that these people were losing their home.
And land is like your middle name in the Marshalls. Everyone is born belonging to a piece of land, a piece of sea. Everyone has a place they can go and grow food on, live on, fish from. It's your birthright, it's your future, it's what you pass on to your kids. It's extraordinarily important. It's part of the most Indigenous cultures have that, and the Marshallese are no different. And so for them to decide to move and to leave their land was an extraordinarily difficult and big decision to make.
Their ancestors had lived on the Rongelap Atoll for thousands of years. That 17th of May, 1985, was the final farewell, a fateful day for the islanders. But the evacuation also made a deep impression on the lives of the Rainbow Warrior crew members. Hank and Bunny returned 3 months later. Friends in Majato helped them build a seaworthy supply ship.
They'll never forget us either. That was a two-way street. Because they saw us and they thought, there's that Greenpeace boat. What is this all about? They had no idea either, you know. And it sort of worked out.
Some of the new settlers from that time are still living on Majato today. Others moved to Majuro, the capital of the Marshall Islands. The cohesive spirit of community they had before they moved has never returned.
They still managed to keep their communities intact, and that is why the Rongelapese chose a particular island to move to that was not inhabited by another community, because they wanted to be able to stay intact as a community as much as they could. That's what they still had if they didn't have their land, was who they were as a people. So they chose rather a difficult island to move to. It wasn't very productive in terms of food, and it didn't necessarily have a lot of good fishing around it, but it actually meant they could stay intact as a community, and that was really significant for them.
The inhabitants of the Bikini Atoll also attempted to settle back into their old home, and they too failed. In 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced the speedy return of the, at that time, 540 Bikinians. In late 1978, the atoll was evacuated once again. The 139 inhabitants settled mainly on Majuro and Ejit in the Majuro Atoll. There, they and their descendants still live today. They still call themselves Bikinians, even though most of them have never cast eyes on Bikini. "70 years ago, America's bombs destroyed the islanders' homeland, took away everything that was important and sacred to them. The compensation payments, to which all descendants have since been entitled, have finally robbed them of their identity too. They have been taught to take, an attitude of dependency imparted to even the youngest. The only authority is the church.
Church play a very important role in bringing people together. Looking back to the first migration, the first thing the Bikinian did when they left Bikini, they went to the church and disassembled this church. And they took the church with them. So wherever they go, it's the first thing they do. They always build a church and live around the church and expand.
Sunday is the day of community. After church, they cook, eat, and talk together in a desperate attempt to save the community from disintegration.
Well, we have different kind of food, chicken, hot dog, fish, sesame, salad, and all the people prepare the food.
Since these people were again flown out of Bikini, they sense that they've been part of some experiment.
In 1968, it was clean to go back. Well, it was assumed that it was clean to go back. This particular group went back to Bikini. So they ate the fish, the coconut crab, the coconut, everything that they said that is poison, they ate them for 10 years. And 1978, they said, well, sorry, but, it's too hot. But of course, the U.S. Department of Energy would come to Bikini and did a lot of studies on human body, do all the body count.
This suspicion alone is monstrous.
So you have to understand, these weapons went off, they got snowed upon, and for the rest of their lives, these people were studied constantly. And if that were me, I'd be feeling like, wow, I feel like a guinea pig. So I understand that, but whether or not the U.S. really intentionally did that at the beginning, it's hard for me to say. I'd love to be able to say, yes, they did. I'm sort of like, I have mixed feelings about it.
The largest coherent community of Bikinians is still the one on Kili. This barren island is home to around 500 people. There's a school, a sports ground, and a satellite dish to connect them to the outside world. There's no work, no agriculture, just the monthly checks from America. Those who still live here and stay here have accepted their fate. An aircraft flies in the monthly rations, diesel for the generator, food, water. If someone forgets cigarettes, half the population suffers withdrawal symptoms.
The people that get food are the ones that get the money. You know, we have like a thing, like a payment that everybody gets. Sometimes 100 some, sometimes 200 some. Every time the ships come, they come and look at the food and see how much we get and how much everybody should have.
Bonita went to high school in Hawaii. She lived in Oregon. She managed to make the break, but then she came back. She missed the place, she says. She shares the house here with her mother, her daughter, and an aunt. What they get to eat is decided in faraway Majuro, when the islanders' food rations are put together. Canned peas, canned corn, and canned meat.
Corn and mixed vegetables.
For special occasions, chicken drumsticks, deep frozen, defrosted, barbecued.
That's not healthy what they give us. Old chicken, quarter leg. What do you call that thing? A dog. Here, take it, eat it. Take it or leave it. We don't have a choice, just eat it. Sometimes it's rough to go fishing. That's what we really want to eat fish too, but we can't.
This resignation is also a long-term effect of the bombs.
People here have what I call, and this is, I don't know, I call it a victim mentality. It's like, I've been victimized. The United States took my land away. They bombed me. They affected my health with what I have to eat now. They owe me everything. And you can't argue with that. For me, when I hear it all the time, I understand the feeling. They've been screwed, and they feel like they are owed. And I completely understand that. The problem I see with it is it zaps people's motivation.
It takes an hour to walk around the island. The landing strip for the planes takes up almost an entire side of the island. Kili has been flooded several times. In 6 stormy months of the year, the ocean takes everyone who dares to venture out in a boat.
When we had that big tide, it was coming from the ocean and then rising from the ground at the same time. So it was really weird because it was like bubbling and coming up, rising, and water coming from the ocean. It really happened fast. It was like minutes and the water was going up. After that time, it just flooded easily here. If the tide is high and it rains, it can rain like 2 or 3 days. Lately, we've had it, like it comes and goes.
After the first serious flood, something resembling a dike was built.
They had people from Madro come and try to cover it. I don't think it's that secure. If we had one of those again, it's gonna go just...
The first catastrophe is far from being over, and already the next one is looming large. Climate change.
Climate change is a major issue, and I am a very firm believer in its anthropomorphic. Man is behind it. It's definitely happening, but I think it's being overplayed. Again, it's being politicized. With radiation, you're dealing with half-lives. The radiation is tapering down. I bet it slowly. But unless we do something about the climate change and global warming, This place could go under.
Here, in a place where the islands are barely above sea level, a rise of up to 3 meters is expected. So now, as the financial wells of atomic compensation payments are threatening to run dry, global warming offers new hope as a source of international aid. Decades of subsidies have largely killed off people's own initiative. Instead of growing food in gardens of their own, they wait for canned vegetables.
This is where they're trying to grow the food, and right now they only have pigs, but they're waiting for somebody from Maduro to come and teach these boys that are working here to grow things like watermelons. And I think we had that point in our life where it's like, why? I'm not gonna go hungry, you know? If I'm here, I get whatever I want. Every house has AC and that hot water and everything, modern technology. We have cell phones, cell system, the power system, the water system. Right now we have this, it's new.
The feared rise in sea levels is a real threat for the inhabitants on Kili, and at the same time, the next catastrophe to further cement their role as victims. The role America's atom bombs have played so far is now being taken over by the CO2 emissions of industrialized nations. When the priest speaks of the promised land, it's not clear to everyone whether he means the Old Testament and the promise made by God, or Bikini and the promise made by the Americans.
It seems to me that the desire to go back to their old home, to Bikini, is no more than a communal dream, just like the longing for the lost paradise that we know from the Holy Bible. There are only a few people left alive from the generation deported from Bikini, Kwajalein and Rongerik. That's why I have mixed feelings about whether a return would make any real sense.
Life on the island is not only limited by its remote location, but also by strict rules. The disco they wanted was demonized by the priest. There's no television. What's left is films on video, war games in American uniforms, and dreams.
I want to be a nurse. Doctor.
Doctor.
I want to live in here.
At 10 o'clock in the evening, curfew begins. Alcohol is strictly forbidden. The evenings on Kili are long. What people here know of the world outside comes from video cassettes in the form of action films and video sermons.
It's an action movie. It's really violent. Mostly American movie, Asian. That's all. No Bikini Atoll movie.
Even though everyone here has seen every film a few times over, business is still good for the island's only video rental store.
Most people on this island, they enjoy watching movies. So mostly they rent DVD every night.
Men, they can come and chat and drink coffee and play cards. As women, we stay home, cook, do whatever we can, and basically these are the things that, you know, kills time.
Whether it really was atomic weapons that have kept the peace over the last 70 years has always been and will remain a controversial issue. The lawsuit filed by the Republic of the Marshall Islands at the International Court of Justice against nations failing to comply with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was rejected. The nuclear arms race goes on worldwide.